Everyone, welcome to today's Tool Talk, Identifying Invasive Species Breeding Shifts, which is co-hosted by the Northeast CASC and the Northeast Risk Management Network. My name is Caroline Gleason. I'm going to be your moderator today. I'm a program specialist for the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. Our goal here is to bring researchers and practitioners together to share some of the invasive species management tools that are currently available, to discuss how these tools have developed and evolved over time, and to really dig into what makes for successful management tools in a world that can sometimes feel like tool overload. And we just kind of want to get to the heart of that matter. So really excited to be here with you all. A couple of housekeeping notes. We're going to be recording today's discussion, and we plan to post that recording to YouTube in the next couple of weeks. We will also be developing a mini summary of all the tools mentioned by our panelists and in the chat, and that will go out to all the registrants at the same time as that recording. So you'll have something to come away with, and we'll send that out once the recording's online. Since we are recording the discussion, feel free to have your camera on if you don't mind being recorded. If not, no worries. Also, since we've got a pretty big group, we've got 99 people in the room right now, a lot of our audience discussion is going to happen over the chat, which is exciting and fun and a good way to engage. So if folks want to go ahead and introduce themselves in the chat, maybe share your name, your location, and a little bit about what you do. That would be awesome. I'm going to end our poll and share our responses here. It looks like we've got about 35% of folks here identify as a natural resource or land manager. About 34% are scientists or researchers, so kind of even split of researchers and practitioners. We got 6% policymakers, 14% working in that extension boundary spanning engagement space, and 12% other. So a really good mix of folks here. We're excited to have you. And so just to note also for that chat, I'm going to be monitoring the chat for questions to pose to our panelists down the line. If there's anything you see in there that you really want to see addressed by the panel, give it a thumbs up or an upvote. We'll make it a little easier for me to catch it. Yeah, I think that's everything. So to kick us off, I'm going to pass things over to Jenica Allen, who's going to give us a brief introduction to the topic of invasive species and climate change. Jenica, take it away.
Great. Thanks, Caroline. And thanks everybody who's spending part of your afternoon here with us for this tool talk. I'm glad that you're here. And this first short segment is really to just make sure that we have a baseline vocabulary and understanding of what we're here to talk about today. So I want to start by addressing this recent landmark science synthesis document that was put together by an IPBES panel that is essentially a global synthesis of invasion science and invasion management science. And one of the many things that came out of this report was that this is not a one place in the world problem, right? This is an everywhere on the globe problem. And when I say everywhere on the globe problem, what I mean is that there are non-native species, so species that have been transported from one place to another, generally by humans. Sometimes we use the term non-native, sometimes we use the term alien, but these species have been introduced to new ecosystems. And while there's many, many non-native species, not all of them are classified as invasive. Recent best estimates are somewhere between 17 and 25% of non-native species can be classified as invasive. So we're talking about a subset of these non-native species globally. And really the thing that sets invasive species apart from any other non-native is that they have these negative impacts, whether that's ecological, economic, or human health. And when you look across all species, terrestrial, aquatic, marine, all taxa, what we find is that about 85% of the documented impacts on the environment are negative. So there are sometimes positive benefits of having invasive species around, but those species sort of by definition also have a negative impact that goes along with it. And most of them are just negative. And our management of invasive species is really aimed at reducing all of these environmental impacts that the species have. And, whether we like it or not, climate change is also layered on top of this invasive species issue. And the IPBES report is pretty clear that with climate change, we shouldn't expect the invasive species problem to get any better. And if anything, it becomes more challenging to contend with. And so when we think about how climate change and invasive species can interact, there's a whole bunch of ways that can happen. And today's session is really focused on the middle of this graphic, which is how invasive species might shift on the landscape geographically in response to climate change. Now, if you're interested in all of these other things that we're not going to address today, I would encourage you to look at this management challenge, which is a science synthesis document that was published by the Northeast Risk Management Network and is freely available on the RISC website for you to download and use in whatever way is useful. And what we mean about species range shifts really comes down to suitable environmental conditions sort of moving on the map. So a particular species has a set of preferred or tolerable environmental conditions that it can exist in. And so those conditions we expect to be moving around on a map as climate continues to change. So like this graphic of Massachusetts, it's sort of like what we expect Massachusetts to feel like with end of century climate change. So it's going to feel more like we're in the Southeast than Massachusetts historically. And so what that means for species is that they're going to track that climate contingent on their ability to move, of course. And so if we take this map on the right-hand side, the black dots are places where we have observed this species on the ground. The red shaded areas are places where we've modeled that it should have suitable habitat with current climate. So these are places that we haven't necessarily looked for the species, but we would anticipate finding it there if we went to its particular habitat. And then the gold shaded areas are places where its range might expand with climate change. So those are places that, historically would not have been climatically suitable for this species, but with climate change might become accessible if dispersal is possible. And this is all important and relevant in the context of invasive species management because we can fall at various places on this invasion management curve. And so on the x-axis here, we've got time since introduction. And so on the left-hand side, there's always a before, right? Before the species was introduced. And then on the y-axis, basically, it's how bad is the invasion? So how much area is infested? What's the abundance? And after introduction, we sort of have this logistic curve of like how bad the invasion gets. And we can categorize management activities along that invasion curve. So sort of the pre-introduction, we're talking about prevention. A number of studies have showed that that's the most cost-effective way to deal with invasive species is just prevent them from the get-go. Then we've got the immediately post-introduction when eradication is still possible with the early detection and rapid response or EDRR strategies. And then moving on to containment and control, as the invasion becomes more widespread. And so really, when we're talking about range shifting invasive species, we have the opportunity to try to push ourselves left on that invasion management curve. Maybe we can actually prevent some of these range shifts from happening. If we can't prevent them from happening, we can be, predictive about which species are likely to move and to where, such that we can develop EDRR programs, for example, to try to eradicate any new incursions. So I'm going to stop there. We have really fabulous panel that's excited to share with you. So I'm going to send it back over to Caroline to get us started.
Awesome. Thank you for that intro, Jenica, kind of getting us all on a level playing field here to start this conversation. So now we're going to hear a little bit from our panelists. Catherine, would you want to start us off and tell us a little bit about how you deal with climate change and invasive species in your work and what your role in invasive management tools are as a developer, as a user? Tell us a little bit about what you do.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Catherine Jarnovich and I work for the U.S. Geological Survey in Fort Collins, Colorado. And a lot of my research has focused on trying to predict where invasive species might be found. So thinking about their potential distribution. And most recently, a lot of that's been focused on making a tool to deliver models that predict where invasive species might be found on the landscape. And with that tool, we use climate information along with other predictors like soils to make habitat suitability models for invasive plant species. And really the focus of this has been thinking about secondary spread of these species. So they're established somewhere in the US and where there might be suitable habitat right now that they might spread to. And this work has been really driven through interactions with resource managers, where a lot of it started with conversations with the Park Service and has evolved over time. And so we've also had other partnerships trying to add in that climate change component. So we've worked with researchers at the Northeast Risk with Bethany Bradley and Annette Evans to use similar types of models and using just climate data to say where is there suitable habitat now and how might that shift in the future. And all of that has been focused on plant species, but we know there's a lot of other taxonomic groups out there that have that are invasive. And so partnering with Wes Daniel, recently we've been working with aquatic invaders and thinking about what species, what aquatic species are problematic in the Southeast right now and in the Midwest, but with changing climates might become a problem in the future in the Northeast. And so that work's kind of going on right now and should be out sometime in the spring. So that kind of gives a little overview of the types of work we're doing.
That's awesome. Thank you, Catherine. And did you, I might have missed it, did you mention the name of the terrestrial plant tool that you were?
So that is the Invasive Species Habitat Tool, or Inhabit. And it has models for, right now, for 259 terrestrial plant species that have all been requested by managers, including models for suitability for occurrence, but also suitability for abundance and suitability for high abundance, thinking about areas where species might really have more impact on the landscape.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So that also might tee up another panelist perfectly. Wesley, do you want to give us a little intro to what you do and what your work looks like?
Yes, thank you. And I appreciate the shout out, Catherine. So I'm Wesley Daniel. I'm also with USGS. I'm a supervisory fisheries biologist at the Wetland Aquatic Research Center in Gainesville, Florida. I have the pleasure of coordinating the non-indigenous aquatic species database, where we track the non-native, invasive, exotic occurrence of basically any aquatic species that's somewhere where it shouldn't be for the entire US, and includes the US territories, Alaska and Hawaii. A lot of the work my team puts in is very similar to Catherine's, thinking critically about risk and spread and suitability of non-native species for planning, for surveillance, and for that early detection, which is so valuable. And so our work mirrors Catherine's. That's why we work so well together, just on the aquatic side. And so Ian Finstein, my botanist, and I have enjoyed working with Catherine and her group on that Northeast project. We also have a Southeast CASC project, thinking critically about established species currently in the Southeast, including on tribal territory lands, and the potential for them to spread with climate change and future conditions. So lots of critical thinking about future risk associated with climate change.
Awesome. Thank you, Leslie, for that great intro. Kind of keeping in tool developer land, Jenica, do you want to tell us a little bit more about your work with invasives and climate change and tools?
Sure. So again, I'm Jenica Allen at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. I'm part of the leadership of the Northeast Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Management Network, or Northeast RISC. And so Northeast RISC is a boundary spanning organization that aims to bring together researchers and practitioners around invasive species and climate change issues. And so I've led a variety of modeling efforts for terrestrial invasive plant, mostly distribution modeling over the years, using a variety of different techniques. But the ones that are probably most relevant to this conversation are climate-based distribution models for about 900 terrestrial invasive plants in the lower 48 US states under current and mid-century climate, so 2040 to 2060. Those species-specific maps are served on EdMaps. So if you go to the county level distribution maps for any species that we've modeled, there's a button there that helps you see, which counties you would expect persistent climatic suitability, which ones you would expect range retraction, and which ones you would expect range expansion with climate change. There's also a complementary map that identifies how many of the kind of future climate scenarios agree that there will be suitable climate for that particular species in the focal county by mid-century. Sort of a companion to that is the invasive range expanders tool. And so that's a more geographically oriented tool rather than a species oriented tool. So in that tool, you're able to select what state you're interested in. And there's a couple other, user selections to be made, but the output is a list of potential invasive range expanding plants for your state. And so Catherine mentioned, having models that identify establishment ranges versus abundance ranges versus high abundance ranges. And so all of these tools are focused on establishment ranges. And so I sort of view them as useful as a starting point to identify what could potentially be a long list of species that needs further prioritization. And so there's a couple other resources that through the Northeast RISC team have been developed to aid some of that prioritization. And so there's a database of regulated invasive plants in the lower 48 states that I think Gary might mention in a moment, we'll see. And then also some impact assessments using the environmental impact classification for alien taxa methodology, or ICAT. And so all of those impact assessments are publicly available through the Northeast RISC website.
Awesome. Thank you for that run through, Jenica. That's so helpful. So kind of moving out of development land into tool use land, heading from Massachusetts to Maine. Gary, do you want to tell us a little bit about what you do and how you work with invasive species and climate change every day?
Sure. So my role at the Maine Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry is the state horticulturist is my title, but really I'm the state plant regulatory official and supervise a number of plant health programs that many of them deal with invasive species, everything from those that are attacking honeybees to plants and forest insects and diseases and a little bit of everything. And one of my duties is to develop quarantines to slow the spread for some of these pest problems. And the other thing that I do is develop rules and policy that would ban the certain sale of some invasive plants. And that is probably where we've used these tools the most. at this point, where Northeast Risk, Eve Bury, who worked there before, provided us with lots of information on plants that could potentially be moving into Maine. We've used the list that Jenica mentioned that looks at what's being regulated in other states. So we're often looking at Connecticut and New York, Massachusetts, and seeing what may be there that could be on the horizon, especially if we can get information about what kinds of habitats it's going to invade and match those up with habitats in the state of Maine. And there's a lot of other tools. I like the idea of the EdMaps invasive range spanning expander listing tool. That didn't really come out when we were getting ready to do our initial assessment of the 5-year reassessment of plants that would be regulated in Maine. But our regulation requires every 5 years to go back and look at what plants may be becoming invasive in Maine or could potentially become invasive in Maine. So we'll be using those tools at that time to help figure out what might be coming. With the data that we got from Northeast Risk and some other different research resources that we used, we do have what's called a watch list now, which some other states have as well. And at least a few of the plants on that watch list are ones that we know are not suitable right now. They maybe will grow in Maine, but they act as annuals, even though they're perennials, and they are becoming invasive in Massachusetts or Connecticut. And so we expect that those will, over the next 5 or 10 years, start to become a problem in Maine.
Awesome. Thank you, Gary. That's such a helpful overview. If anybody has seen me scribbling, I'm writing down all of the questions that are going to come up later. So also feel free to drop questions as they come up into the chat and we'll come back to them. Something I'm really curious about here is how tools have developed and evolved over time, responding to stakeholder feedback, responding to questions of timing of reassessments, like Gary was just mentioning, all sorts of different bits of feedback that might shape a tool from formation to its current state. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about how the tools you've worked on, Jenica, have evolved over time. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'll actually bring us back to like before the tool gets published, right? So that's where a lot of the iteration and sort of changes of the tool happen. We have this sort of a best laid plan or what we think people are going to like, but then when you actually have real users start to interact with it, they're usually quite good at breaking it and identifying all of the potential pitfalls that whatever you've developed have. And so for us and our tools, that was really the process that developed the tool more than anything. It's started on a completely different technology platform. The underlying data was the same, but that's about it. What the user inputs were and user selections changed during that process. And our approach anyway, which I think of all the tools we've talked about today, ours are probably like the oldest tools of all of them. So where we started with this process was, holding workshops at events that Risk was hosting, but then also, hosting workshops at other existing conferences in the Northeast or other meetings to try to workshop and get feedback on the performance and the features of the app.
Awesome. Yeah, I think, and so that's the case for the EdMaps tools. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm mostly speaking about the range expander tool, but also to some extent the species specific maps too, but there just isn't as much to interact with on the map itself.
Yeah, for sure. Awesome. Catherine, how did the process for Inhabit come about? Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so Inhabit started in around 2018, just through, as I mentioned earlier, conversations with people at the National Park Service and what their needs were. And we started out creating suitability models for about 30 species with our initial version. And now we just released our version 4 that has, as I said, 259 species and includes models for occurrence, for abundance, and for high abundance. And the tool itself has evolved over time through different webinars with partners from various management agencies and getting feedback from them on how they want the information delivered. And so we really focused on having a map that could be useful in aiding search, and then also creating these tabular summaries of the model outputs for management units. So you could select your management unit and get a summary of what species have suitability within your unit. And so what we've really focused on so far is getting all the species that people think are important and wanted to see within the tool, and using sets of predictors that managers trust and believe in, because all of the models are, we choose the predictors for each species individually, so they're really kind of more tailored. But in our most recent webinar with partners and getting feedback from them on what they want to see in the future, we plan to incorporate more of the future climate in the next suite of models. And that's already being incorporated into these aquatic models that we're working on. And then for the models for terrestrial plants, considering climate change, those outputs are already being served on EDD maps in the same place that Jenica was talking about. And so that's kind of where we're at right now, but it's a continually evolving process.
Not off mute. In that original kind of conversation or set of conversations with Park Service too, was the question of bringing climate change metrics into the kinds of tools you were thinking about developing part of the conversation, or did that come later?
That's kind of come later because they wanted first to have models they believed in for where things might be on the landscape, current conditions, before moving on to that kind of next step of thinking about the future.
Cool. Very cool. Awesome. So kind of keeping on the stakeholder train too, Wesley, I know the tool that you and Catherine have been working on together for aquatic invaders that started with the stakeholder workshop. Could you tell us a little bit about how that process has gone?
Yeah, absolutely. In my career, I've had a lot of experience working with stakeholders and managers, and I'm a firm believer, as Jenica even mentioned, of that kind of as much co-production as possible. I'm not a believer in if you build it, they will come, because what you build may not be what they need. And so getting that buy-in early on and involvement of our stakeholders and our managers and our researchers in the region was really important to Catherine and I in the scope of that Northeast project. You know, we went as far as kind of defining what species we could potentially utilize in that assessment, giving them a long list. But at the end of the day, they chose the ones that are most important to them, important in their view of management, of the risk they potentially pose, or other potentially important elements that they define. So meeting them there and allowing them to kind of help identify what are those priority species, I think is going to bring a whole lot of value to this end product that Catherine and I are developing for the team, which will live on the non-indigenous aquatic species or NAS database, which I really appreciate Caroline dropping in the link to that database. So appreciate that. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, I love this idea of like letting in narrowing down what species you're going to focus on, letting the people who will be the end users decide, and not how is it that you put it? Like, you can't just build it and expect people to come.
Yeah,
You
they'll
know,
build a
the risk
dreams. If you
build
build it, they will come. Yes.
Yeah, for sure. Catherine, did you have any like takeaways from that stakeholder elicitation process? That's a loose question, sorry.
Yeah, I was just thinking for a second. Um, no, I think that just like Wes said, that getting that input kind of upfront with the project really helps with this success. And I think that's the case with a lot of these tools that we're talking about. So even like in Habit, we started out with that idea came from us sitting down and talking with the National Park Service and Invasive Plant Management Team national program lead and thinking about what they need and what we could do and really coming to that idea together. That's the same thing that we've done with this aquatic project.
Awesome. Yeah, just co-developing and responding to needs. Love it. Gary, you mentioned that a lot of the tools that you're planning to use for this 5-year reassessment process have come through the risk network. How do you go about finding the tools that you use in your day-to-day, and how are you using them in your job?
Well, I think it's really important to stay connected. So I joined the risk network from the very beginning, pretty much, and that was really important. And that network of people keeps you informed, helps you to see what's available out there, lots of different papers that have come out, as well as these tools. And I try to look at all of it. And then when we need to make decisions, usually, like others have talked about here, we have a stakeholder committee that will work together and we'll look at a lot of the different ways of evaluating species and decide if there are tools that we want to use. And someone in the chat mentioned in Maine we use IMAP invasives, not EDMAPs, which I've been trying to encourage going to EDMAPs instead, or to at least get those two to merge together. I think they're both good tools. I think EDMAPs is a little bit more user friendly than IMAP invasives. They both sort of do the same thing. We're also using iNaturalist, and we use the U.S. Forest Service has a lot of information about plants, so we're looking at their data as well to kind of find what we can glean out of that. I do also work with the aquatic invasives program, and so I'm interested in the Inhabit model. I think they'll want to look at something like that. In Maine, we're kind of lucky. We don't have many infested lakes and we don't have many species that have hit so far. So we are definitely trying to look ahead and be ready for things. And I think it's really important to do that. On the other fronts with insects and diseases, it's a little bit harder. I don't we work with the Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, and they are doing evaluations on many of these pests all the time. So we're looking at their reports to see what they're finding and what they think might happen. There are maps for like spotted lanternfly that will give you a little bit of information about where it might become established. So we definitely go and utilize those maps and the resources that are being either funded through USDA APHIS, or they're encouraging folks like in Cornell or at Cornell or Penn State or other top universities that are developing these maps that sort of give you a little bit of a guidance on whether or not a species might be able to get established, and then 10, 15 years later where it might become established. And those have been, I think, really helpful for us to try to decide whether or not to have a lot of concern about something like spotted lanternfly and maybe make it a less of a priority in Maine as it is in other states, because it doesn't look like it'll do all that well in Maine. So I think that's one of the things that you really need these models for, is trying to make decisions on priorities, because there are so many species coming so fast. And there's not enough resources to manage them. So you really need to find ways of prioritizing.
I am curious, I don't want to derail this too much, but what goes into that process of prioritizing? Is it the data that you have available? Is it more on a policy side? How do you go about choosing which species you want to get ahead of?
Well, I'd like it to be a lot more organized than it is.
Fair.
I've been, promoting to our administration, trying to develop a system like they have in New York or Michigan, where they do have a large invasive species plan, and then they have a group that is then taking in all the data and trying to decide what are the priorities, and then they have a lump sum of funds that then people can either compete for, or they can make awards, based on what those priorities might be. And I'm hoping that eventually we'll get to something like that in Maine. Otherwise, it's mostly putting out the fires. And some of it's directed by USDA, where something flares up in a new state and it's federally regulated, so you have to work on it and you have to use resources on it, even though there might be other invasives that would be a higher priority. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and I think that these models can help direct some of that prioritization.
For sure. Yeah, thank you for that, Gary. So I want to kind of engage the chat a little bit here and think about this big umbrella question of what makes for a good or successful tool. What if in your work, if you are managing invasive species, what are you looking for in a tool? Is it something, for example, we were talking about with projecting future climate versus looking at current extent? Is it specific parameters or variables? If you have thoughts, throw them in the chat, and we can kind of bounce ideas around there. But I do also see a question coming in from Kelly of recognizing that some species are becoming more advantageous with climate change and continuing to shift spatially. What can be done to stay ahead of it? Is there, oh, sorry, I got mixed up. Is there any chance to use evidence of invasiveness in abutting states to ban them in a state they might be coming to? This might be a question for you, Gary.
That is something that we definitely did with our watch list, and with a couple of species that's on our do not sell list. We are definitely looking at, if it's becoming really invasive in Massachusetts, then likely it's going to become invasive in Maine. And if we already have some established populations, then we're going to look at that as being an issue. Something like mile-a-minute vine, which has become incredibly invasive in states south of us. We are trying to treat that as an early detection, rapid response species. And so far we've had 4 or 5 reports of it, and we go and eradicate it immediately because we know how bad it can become based on what's happened in other states. And maybe that is a range shifter, maybe not. Maybe it could always have become established here, but it is how we use that information from other states. We definitely are always looking at that.
If I can jump into this conversation too. So one of the things that the Northeast
How am I going to fit into this picture?
Is facilitating a I just got muted unexpectedly. So one of the things that Northeast Risk has been doing is facilitating a community of practice of state representatives from invasive plant councils. It's not always called an invasive plant council in every state, but something similar. Basically, the group that's responsible for evaluating invasive species for potential regulation. And so one of the reasons that we've been facilitating that group is to allow states in the Northeast footprint to, better understand what's happening with their neighbors in terms of their regulatory landscape for particular species. And also to help share resources for the evaluations themselves. So the evaluation process is different in every state. And most of the invasive plant regulation happens at the state level. And so that creates challenges just from a personnel and work hour perspective to complete those evaluations for, I've now forgotten how many states are in our footprint, but a lot, 13, 14 states. We also have representatives from some Canadian provinces in that group as well. And so trying to think creatively about ways that we can share the work that's being done in one state to evaluate a species to another state to get those evaluations done more quickly, particularly for range shifting species, but for all invasive species generally.
Awesome. Thank you, Jenica. I'm also thinking if whether this applies with, as you were mentioning, Catherine, the management partners that have gone into developing tools like Inhabit and the stakeholder process for the aquatic invaders tool. Are those stakeholders in conversation with each other? How does that does this kind of process feed into your work with the tool? I'm not sure if that totally makes sense.
So you're asking how, like the partners that we work with, are they working together?
Yeah, is that something that you see them kind of in conversation with each other, or are they coming to you separately?
I'm not really sure how much goes on now. So we have like our Inhabit partner group, and that's kind of the interactions that I have. And Wes might be able to speak more to on the aquatic side because he's much more involved with those groups than I am.
So on the aquatic side, we have some kind of national organizations that help us kind to bridge a lot of that communication amongst our managers, researchers, industry, nonprofit, all basically any kind of stakeholder. So the Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force and their regional panels aids a lot on the aquatic side in helping with the communication. My team attends all of those regional panel meetings to allow us to kind of stay informed and integrate ourselves where reasonable to make sure that we're meeting the needs of those stakeholders. So I think there are networks out there to aid in that discussion. I love the risk networks. I'm a founding member of the Southeast Risk Network. So if you're not a part of one, the risk or another network, either state or regionally focused, there's a great opportunity to get more involved and stay part of these conversations.
And I will add in, at least on the federal side, there are some groups that facilitate communication across the different federal agencies. But there's not that same structure, I think, that you have with the aquatic species.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Amazing. And I see, Jenica, you've added in the name for that Invasive Plant Council collaboration. I'm seeing in the chat, feel free also drop in any and all questions there for what folks are looking for in a tool and what makes that useful is one response from Sarah of very well documented methods and accessible data. This is something that I feel like comes up a lot in what I've heard talking to people who are developing and using tools is sometimes even just having the data layers themselves viewable and being able to play around within a tool without too many guardrails up can be helpful sometimes. Any thoughts on making your methodology accessible or throwing or any like training that has been thought of as you're developing tools? Or Gary, do you have a lot of time to explore new tools and get acquainted with that? The training element is interesting to me.
No, I don't have a lot of time for that. So it is important to have things accessible and to show, how it was developed and what it's based on, so that when you introduce it to stakeholders, that they can understand it and decide whether or not they trust it. Because a lot of this, especially when it comes down to actually doing regulation and banning something, in Maine, it's mainly plants, you really need to have everybody buy into it. And that's a very diverse group. You've got people that are nursery folks that are selling plants. And then on the other side, you have those that are managing different trails and things like that, that truly hate the plants and hate the people that sell them to some degree. So you have to find a way to make sure that everybody's comfortable with the tools that you're using. So the more documentation there is and the easier it is for them to understand it, the better it can be used.
Definitely. Danica, how have you in your work approached onboarding folks to tools like the EdMaps range expander and other things?
Yeah, I mean, when we first launched the tool, so like after we had gone through our development process and we said, okay, like we feel like this is the tool that we want to release publicly, I feel like I went on, I'm going to call it my world tour, right? Like I feel like I just tried to get myself invited to as many potential stakeholder meetings as I could to talk about the development of the tool, to provide demonstrations of how it worked, and then to offer sort of like follow-up direct support. We also hosted a number of webinars that were recorded and posted publicly that showed, how to use the tool, how it was developed, and then sorts of outputs you would get and how to digest all of that. We also have a tutorial that's on the Northeast Risk tool summaries page. That's basically a step-by-step of how to use the range shifters tool in particular. Though, if I'm totally honest, if I could like a Wayback Machine and could go back and like do it all over again, I think I'd want to like take what I've learned and seen develop in the Inhabit tool. So like Catherine, I'm going to give you a shout out here because I feel like there's pretty much everything under the hood that you could want to know about those models that is readily available online with the tool. I think that is, from my perspective as a developer and also a user, and also a researcher, it's really great to have all of that in like one-stop shop. It feels like we sort of like have the vintage version of an online interface, and all of that information is there. It's just not quite as easy to access. And to Gary's point, people are time limited using these tools, and so they want to be able to get to the information that they need as quickly as possible. And so making that as accessible as you can feels like an important piece as well.
Yeah, definitely. Just like having that information available in a way that's digestible and intentional, I think goes a long way. Any other thoughts on making data available, Wesley or Catherine? Keelan?
So our fellow family is strong believers in making everything publicly accessible. And my database is a great example of that, where we're trying to host all streams of data, both federal and tribal and land managers and academic, and integrating it to make it as accessible and usable as possible. And so, yeah, you could definitely look towards some of these public facing entities, but also don't be afraid to reach out to your USGS colleagues at our different science centers. And if you have questions, I'm happy to direct you to a local one, or maybe I know somebody specifically that could help if you had something of need. So I'm happy to connect you.
Awesome. That actually might also tie in to a question that had come up back in registration of how to integrate data on invasive species from a variety of platforms. So poking around, for instance, on Inhabit, I saw that that data is pulling from a lot of different sources, and is made very visually appealing and digestible. How kind of open floor to any of our panelists or to the chat, how have you gone about pulling data from a lot of different places and trying to visualize it on one map? Is that possible? Have you thought of that?
Feel like Catherine should jump in here first, since you mentioned Inhabit.
Which I loved digging around.
Well, I think we pull a lot of data from different sources to facilitate making the models for Inhabit. So we use data from EDV maps and IMAP invasives and other data sources, but the kind of location data like that we use on Inhabit, we're just showing what data we use to fit the model, which is like a filtered subset of that. So we're not trying to be a distribution data hub or anything. But we do use that data that we pool together from these different sources to fit the models, and then also to inform, making those summaries for different management areas, like how far is it to a known occurrence? Is there a known occurrence within this management area for this species? But I think I was thinking of a project that Wes is leading that's trying to aggregate different things.
Yeah, so it's completely possible. You just kind of have to know the information, the metadata behind the data, how it's collected, what does it represent, and make sure you're just utilizing it appropriately. The most simple is occurrence, presence, absence, right? And maybe not, that absence may not even be real. It might just be truly presence. And then the more data, the variety of different methods may allow more interesting or more robust kind of assessments, thinking about abundance or community assessments versus individual species assessments. So it is completely possible. You just have to be careful that you're using the data appropriately. So.
Awesome, definitely. I'm seeing a comment in the chat too from Tristan that it's important to note pulling data from lots of different sources can be an extremely time-consuming process. Small differences in organization or sampling methods can take time to adjust or determine if it's all used the same or differently. I'm seeing a lot of head nods. It definitely seems like a process of rooting around and investing that time to make sure that you are able to use the data appropriately, as Wes was saying. Any other thoughts on aggregating data, pulling from multiple platforms? Cool. I might leave us too with a question of what's next in invasive range shift tools. What's next for this frontier? Are there unmet needs for people in the chat that there isn't an existing tool that addresses XYZ challenge? Is it a question of moving more towards these future projections? What open floor to the panel and to the chat, what do we see as next for this field? I'm seeing a comment from Brittany about open access and open source, which isn't, I think you had submitted it before I asked that question, but to me, that also feels like open access and open source data is maybe a thing we're thinking more about now.
Yeah, for me, that's been part of the process for as long as we've been able to make it happen.
And Gary is correct. If it's developed with federal funds, it will be public. It may not be immediate because there's always a review process, but it always becomes public.
Any other thoughts on that? Yeah, Jenica, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I don't have
No,
any
you're good.
thought for you.
Awesome. Any other thoughts on what's next from the chat? Trying to practice the like education, wait them out process.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like we've talked about a lot of projects that are sort of like midstream still happening. So it's hard to think like the next step even after that.
That's so true. Yeah. So in that case, then we've got just a couple of minutes at the end here. I saw earlier, oh, thank you, Thomas. So we've got a question on long-term sustainability of tools, server and software support, which I think might also a little bit tie into continue or sustained funding for tools and maintenance. As from Thomas, some tools in adjacent fields have been deprecated after lack of funding for servers or changes in software platforms. Catherine, how have you guys thought about continuing? Are you working grant to grant, or thoughts on longevity of the tools you've developed?
Some of the advantage, maybe the lesson I have being in the federal government, is that if we can show that there are stakeholders that say that they need our product and that they're using our product, then we can continue to get funds to keep those going. So, and Habit has been around since 2018, and we have funding into the future. So as long as the partners that we're working with are willing to say that it's useful, then we seem to be able to keep going. And I think Wes, the database he's working with, has been around
since 1990. Yeah, so continuous funding since 1990. And the other part that Catherine and I are very thoughtful on is when we are developing new features or tools, making them in a way that they are sustainable. They don't take large investments in updating or maintaining them. So that's another element that's important.
And I would say on my end, coming from an academic setting, you know, we are tied to grant cycles and grant support in terms of, you know, updating and maintaining tools. We're really lucky that we've had some more institutional partners to host and serve, and in some ways technically develop and maintain the tools that we have helped to make available. So without the support of EdMaps, for example, the tools that I've mentioned would no longer exist. So we are reliant on those partnerships for the longevity of the tools. But thankfully, we've got good working relationships, and you know, in much the same way, if we can demonstrate that the tools are useful and potentially have new features to develop, that makes us competitive for additional funding to support new aspects of it.
Awesome. Thank you all. So we are down to the wire here. It seems like for me, I'm coming away with a theme of networks, partnerships, talking to each other, and kind of co-production in making sure that tools stay around and serve their purpose. And that I'm pretty happy with that as a takeaway message. With our last like 30 seconds, I'm gonna throw a couple things into the chat. We've got links to the Northeast CASC contact page, website, mailing list, Northeast Risk Management Network, links in there. And then for any folks still on the line, I am throwing in a quick exit survey. If anybody has a couple moments to fill that out, your feedback is so appreciated. I'm going to email that out to everybody who registered as well. And yeah, including policymakers and tool development for sure, Gary, that is spot on. you need that support. Any final thoughts from our panel? Anything you want to leave us with? Feeling good?
Thanks everyone here that's doing good work.
Yes. Thank you, everybody, and thanks for being here on a Wednesday afternoon. And have a great rest of your night.